The lights on the set were colder than he expected. Elon had been under studio lights hundreds of times before, but there was something in the way these ones hit his skin that made him feel unusually exposed. Not physically, not in the way that heat can prick the skin. It was something else. Something about this moment felt different, like the room itself was waiting to judge him before he even spoke. The segment was supposed to be about electric vehicles and grid infrastructure. At least, that was what the producer said during the pre-interview. It was framed as a thoughtful conversation, a chance to talk about solutions, a shared future. Elon agreed to come on because he still believed that ideas could win, even in places where he didn't feel particularly welcome. Rachel was professional when she greeted him. Her handshake was firm, her smile precise. She asked him about traffic on the way in, and he answered with a light joke about self-driving cars being better interview chauffeurs. She chuckled politely, but her eyes didn't change. There was no warmth there, just calculation. Elon noticed it, but said nothing. They sat across from each other with the cameras off, waiting for the director's cue. Elon folded his hands in his lap. Rachel reviewed her notes one last time. The stage manager counted down from 5 with fingers alone. Then the red light blinked on. Rachel opened the segment with the same calm confidence that had made her famous. Her voice had rhythm, her words curved deliberately. She welcomed viewers and introduced her guest with formal respect, calling him a visionary and an industry disruptor. Elon gave a small nod, his posture open, his expression neutral. She began with questions about climate change and renewable energy. Elon responded with statistics about battery efficiency and global adoption curves. He talked about lithium supply chains and the transition timeline to a post-carbon economy. His voice was steady. His answers were clear. He was trying to keep the conversation technical, above the noise, anchored in data. But Rachel kept steering it somewhere else. She brought up accusations. Not direct ones at first, but implied. She referenced labor controversies. She quoted critics who accused his companies of greenwashing. She read tweets out loud. The screen behind them flashed images of protest signs and online headlines. Elon sat still, listening. He had faced these questions before, but something about the framing felt off this time. He answered each point carefully. He acknowledged imperfections. He spoke about growing pains, complex trade-offs, the balance between innovation and reality. But each answer seemed to slide off Rachel's desk like water off glass. She didn't nod. She didn't respond to what he said. She just moved to the next accusation, the next quote, the next headline. Eventually, she asked a question that didn't sound like a question at all. She said, "Some people say your vision of the future leaves too many people behind. That it's driven by ego, not equity. How do you respond to that?" Elon looked at her, not with anger, but with something quieter, a kind of sadness. He took a breath, and for the first time in the interview, he didn't reach for data. He said, "I grew up in a country where the power went out almost every night. I used to do my homework by candlelight. When I think about the future, I think about kids like I was. I think about them having light, having access, having possibility. If that's ego, then maybe we've misunderstood the word." Rachel didn't respond. The silence that followed was not the kind that invites reflection. It was the kind that waits to strike. She turned to the camera again and asked about his influence over online speech. She referenced specific bans, reinstatements, and political content decisions. The screen behind her now showed screenshots from his social media platform. Elon's jaw tightened slightly. He leaned forward. He said, "People should be allowed to speak, even when I disagree with them, especially when I do. If we only allow speech we like, we don't have freedom. We have compliance." Rachel raised an eyebrow and said, "Even if that speech causes harm?" Elon paused, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he understood what was happening now. This wasn't a conversation. It was a framing, a slow trap, and he had walked into it, willingly. He said, "If you define harm broadly enough, anything can be silenced. The solution to bad ideas is better ideas, not censorship." Rachel looked directly into the camera and said, "Some would say that's a convenient answer from someone who benefits from being the loudest voice in the room." There was no cue, but Elon reached up and gently removed his microphone. He stood up slowly. The crew froze. Rachel looked at him, surprised but composed. Elon said nothing to her. Instead, he looked at the producer behind the glass. The same producer who had promised this would be a good-faith conversation. He said, "I came here to talk about energy. I think people watching deserve that." Then he walked off set. Rachel didn't follow. The cameras kept rolling, but the room felt wrong now. Not dramatic, just hollow. The confrontation would go viral within the hour. But in that moment, Elon wasn't thinking about headlines. He was thinking about the sound of the power cutting out back home, the way darkness used to fill every corner of the room, and how long it had taken him to believe that light could come from something he built with his own hands. The clip was already circulating before Elon reached the car. The driver was silent. The engine purred softly as they pulled away from the studio lot. But inside the vehicle, the only sound was the steady rhythm of notifications lighting up Elon's phone. Messages came in from all corners of his world. Some from engineers, some from board members, some from people he hadn't spoken to in years. There were those who said he looked strong, those who said he looked petty, those who said nothing but sent the clip with a question mark. Elon didn't reply. He stared out the window, watching the city pass in fast, disconnected pieces. Billboards, traffic lights, pedestrians, the flash of an ambulance, someone holding a sign that said, "Rent is theft." He tried not to assign meaning to any of it. He just watched. His assistant called twice. He let it ring both times. There was nothing she could say that he didn't already know. The media would spin it. His opponents would sharpen it into something surgical. His supporters would turn it into a badge. But none of it would change the fact that he had walked off. Not because he lost his temper. Not because he couldn't handle the pressure. But because something inside the room had gone hollow. That silence after Rachel's final line had followed him into the car, and it still hadn't let go. By the time Elon got home, it was nearly midnight. The house was quiet. He lived in one of his smaller properties now, a deliberate choice, not a necessity. A decision made after too many nights in mansions that echoed too loudly with the wrong kind of silence. This place was different. Bare concrete walls, minimal furniture, no paintings, just tools, books, and screens. He sat down at the kitchen counter and poured himself a glass of water. Not wine, not whiskey, just water. Something clean, something grounded. He opened his laptop and watched the clip again. He studied Rachel's face. He studied his own. He listened to the exact tone she used when she said the word ego. He replayed the moment he took off the microphone. He watched himself walk away, not defiantly, but deliberately, slowly, with finality. Then he opened the comments. Some were vicious. Some were poetic. Most were loud. But here and there, between the noise, he saw something else. Not approval, not outrage, just curiosity. People asking, why did he leave? People wondering, what was he trying to say? People saying, I don't like him, but I wanted to hear more. That was the crack in the noise. That was where the oxygen lived. Elon opened a new document and started typing. Not a tweet, not a press release, just a stream of thought. Words he hadn't said aloud. Things he had been thinking for years, but never shared on camera. He didn't know if he would publish it, but he needed to see the thoughts out in front of him, to understand them, to understand himself. He wrote about how tired he was of being turned into a character, how every answer he gave was bent to fit a narrative, how he wasn't a hero or a villain, just a man with a strange brain and a hard past trying to move the needle in a world addicted to staying still. He wrote about the first time someone called him arrogant, and how he remembered thinking that maybe it was true. He had been so sure he was right, so sure that logic could carry the day. But certainty and ego weren't the same thing, and it had taken him too long to learn the difference. He wrote about the darkness, the real kind, the kind that clings to you even in well-lit rooms, the kind that followed him from Pretoria to Palo Alto, the kind that spoke to him late at night when everything was quiet, whispering that none of it would ever be enough. He wrote until the words started to come slower, until the water in his glass had gone warm, until his fingers hovered over the keyboard with nothing left to say. Then he saved the file, closed the laptop, sat still, not angry, not triumphant, just still. Out there, the internet was on fire. But in here, for the first time in weeks, Elon felt something close to peace. Not because he had won anything, but because, for a moment, he had remembered who he was before any of this had started. The next morning began the same way every high-profile controversy began. Headlines raced each other to outframe the moment. Every outlet had a version. Some framed Elon as a coward. Others called him principled. A few asked honest questions, but most just chose sides and sharpened their angles. The clip was replayed, dissected, memed, and remixed. People who hadn't seen the full interview had already formed their conclusions. Elon skimmed the noise, but didn't engage. The document he had written the night before stayed unopened. He wasn't ready to share it. Not yet. Not because he was afraid, but because he understood something he hadn't fully grasped before last night. That timing mattered. That saying something true didn't guarantee it would be heard. Sometimes truth needed silence first, so it could land without resistance. By mid-morning, Rachel Maddow's team released a statement. It was measured, polished, and clearly written to avoid escalation. The message praised open dialogue while reaffirming journalistic integrity. It said the show stood by its line of questioning. It said Elon had every right to leave, and they respected that choice. But it also hinted that walking away was a refusal to answer difficult questions. That was the phrase that stuck. Refusal to answer. Elon read the statement twice. Then he closed his browser and opened a design file on his computer. Not a statement. Not a response. Just blueprints. Battery layouts. Mars capsule schematics. Launch site logistics. The things that didn't spin. The things that couldn't lie. He spent hours with them. Not because there was anything urgent to fix, but because he needed to anchor himself in something real. The machines didn't ask what he meant. They just asked what was next. Later that afternoon, his assistant buzzed through. She said there was a request from an employee who had watched the interview and wanted to speak with him. Not a director. Not a VP. A technician. First year. Young. Nervous. The assistant offered to screen the request, but Elon said no. He asked her to send the person up. 20 minutes later, the door opened and a young man stood awkwardly near the threshold. His name was Thomas. Early 20s. Grew up in Ohio. Elon remembered glancing at his hiring file a few months ago. Strong math scores. Weak social references. Looked terrified to be in the room. Elon didn't offer a handshake. He just gestured to the chair across from him. Thomas sat. He took a breath, and then said something Elon hadn't expected. He said, "I just wanted to thank you for walking off." Elon raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He waited. Thomas shifted in his seat. He said, "I don't know if everything you do is right. I'm not smart enough to even have an opinion on half of it. But when you got up and left that interview, I felt something I haven't felt in a long time." Elon leaned forward slightly, not with intensity, but with interest. Thomas continued, "My whole life, I've watched people try to be understood. Not to be agreed with. Just understood. And every time they tried, someone interrupted. Someone reframed. Someone twisted their words before they could finish. And it started to feel like maybe being understood wasn't allowed anymore. But then you walked away. You didn't argue. You didn't blow up. You just left. And for some reason, that gave me hope." The room went quiet again. But this time, it wasn't hollow. It was full, heavy with meaning. Elon nodded. Slowly. Then asked a question. He said, "Why do you think it gave you hope?" Thomas thought for a long time. Then he said, "Because it reminded me that dignity isn't loud. And sometimes, the most honest thing a person can do is stop talking and stand up." Elon sat back in his chair. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say much at all. He just looked at this young man, this first-year technician with no platform and no followers, and felt something shift quietly inside him. Not a revelation. Not a breakthrough. Just a quiet realization that maybe, in all his calculations, he had underestimated the emotional weight of restraint. The way silence could speak when words had failed. When Thomas left the office, he did so with a little less tension in his shoulders. Elon watched him go, then turned back to his screen. Not to write. Not to respond. Just to think. Outside, the storm was still spinning. But inside, something steady had begun to form. The calls started shifting in tone by the third day. At first, they were typical. Strategists urging a statement, PR consultants offering damage control, board members pushing for clarity. But something changed after the second wave of public reaction. The commentary had started to fracture. New voices were surfacing. Writers, scientists, small creators, ordinary people, people who didn't usually comment on these things, were saying that maybe the moment deserved more reflection. Maybe the walk-off wasn't a meltdown, but a message. Someone wrote, "He didn't storm out. He just stood up. There's a difference." Someone else posted, "Maybe our media isn't set up for people who build things instead of sell opinions." And somewhere deep in a thread with barely a dozen likes, someone quietly typed, "He looked tired." Not angry, just tired. That one stayed with Elon. Because it was true. He was tired. Not from the confrontation itself, but from the slow erosion of what conversations used to mean. The way every sentence now came pre-weighed, pre-interpreted, prejudged. The way words no longer built bridges, only fences. He had built companies that launched rockets and cars, but he couldn't build a sentence that landed without suspicion. And yet, here and there, people were noticing. Not the usual voices. Not the verified accounts or pundits with perfect lighting. But quiet people. Engineers. Teachers. Nurses. People who had watched the full interview and come away not with fury, but questions. People who weren't sure what to make of it, but who knew that what they saw wasn't what the headline said it was. That evening, Elon walked alone through the empty floor of one of his factories. The night crew was light. Machines were idle. The echo of his footsteps bounced off steel and concrete. He liked being here when it was quiet. The space made sense. There was no spin here. No commentary. Just things that worked or didn't. He stopped beside a partially assembled battery rig and ran his hand along the cold frame. He didn't know why he'd come here, but he trusted the impulse. When he was young, this was where he felt most alive. Not in studios or meetings, but in spaces where things were made with hands and heat and pressure. His phone buzzed. It was a message from his brother, Kimball. It read, "Not sure if you're reading any of this, but I think you're being seen more clearly now than you have in a long time. Even by people who don't like you." Elon stared at the message for a while, then typed one word in reply. "Maybe." The next morning, the producer from Rachel's show sent a private message. It wasn't public, and it wasn't long. It said, "We'd like to finish the conversation. Off camera. No microphones. Just talk." Elon read it twice. Then a third time. He didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, he stood up from his desk and walked to the window. The city stretched out in sharp morning light. There were stories being written in every window, behind every rooftop, under every billboard. He knew most of them would never be told, and the ones that were would be flattened until they fit the shape people wanted to see. But something had happened in the silence. He wasn't sure what it was yet, but he knew it mattered, and that meant he needed to protect it, even from himself. By the end of the week, the narrative had begun to split, not fracture into noise, but diverge into something more complicated. Some commentators insisted Elon had walked off out of weakness, that he couldn't stand the heat. Others argued he had reclaimed his agency, that refusing to perform in a space designed to trap him was its own kind of power. But the deeper conversations were not about Elon at all. They were about something quieter, something that had been building under the surface for years. People were beginning to talk about dignity, not as a weapon, not as a brand, but as a human need. Someone wrote, "It's strange that in a world obsessed with exposure, the first real thing I've seen in a while was a man choosing to leave." And someone else replied, "He didn't say anything dramatic. He just said enough." That idea kept coming back. He just said enough. In the office, Elon's leadership team remained tense. There were deals in motion, licenses under review, governments watching closely. Some argued he needed to clear the air. Others wanted him to take legal action against the show. A few simply wanted the moment to be over, like a bad storm that had lingered longer than it should have. Elon listened to all of it. He said very little. Then one morning, he asked them a question. He said, "What if we didn't try to fix this?" The room went still. He clarified, "What if we just let people think what they want to think? Let the moment settle. Let the silence breathe. No campaign. No statement. No retort." One executive leaned forward and said, "That's not how media works. If you don't define the narrative, someone else will." Elon nodded. They already did. But something strange happened this time. Some people looked past it. Not because we told them to, but because we didn't. No one responded immediately. Not because they agreed, but because they were still trying to understand what he meant. He stood up from the table and added, "Sometimes dignity isn't about pushing back. Sometimes it's about not needing to." Then he left the room. Later that afternoon, the producer from the Maddow show sent a second message. This time, it was longer, more personal. It said she had watched the clip again. Not the whole interview, just the final moment. The way Elon had looked at the glass, not the host. The way he had spoken with weight, not volume. The way he had walked, not stormed. She wrote, "I think I missed what you were actually trying to say. I was listening for contradictions instead of meaning. If you're still willing to meet, the offer stands." Elon didn't answer that day. Instead, he did something that surprised his own staff. He walked down to the employee commons, unannounced, and sat alone at one of the long tables during lunch hour. No press, no assistants, no agenda. A few workers approached, cautiously. He welcomed them with a quiet nod. They asked how he was doing. He said, "Better than people think." One woman, an AI engineer from Mumbai, asked if he regretted the interview. He said, "No, I regret what it replaced." She asked what he meant. He said, "We were supposed to talk about building things. About power grids and supply chains and storage solutions. We were supposed to talk about how to move the future closer. But instead, we talked about me." She was quiet for a while, then said something he hadn't expected. She said, "Maybe people needed to see you be human first, before they could hear your ideas." Elon looked at her and said nothing. Not because he disagreed, but because she might have been right. That evening, he opened the document he had written the night of the interview. He read it slowly. Then he made one small edit. At the very top, he typed, "This isn't a defense. This is a reminder." Then he saved it again. Still unpublished. Still waiting. But one step closer to being ready. The invitation arrived on a Monday. Not from Rachel. Not from the show. From a university. A quiet, mid-sized campus on the East Coast, known more for its engineering graduates than its press presence. The email was respectful and unpolished, clearly written by someone who didn't expect a reply. It said, "We're hosting a lecture series on the future of public discourse. We'd be honored if you spoke. Not as a CEO, not as a symbol, just as a person who walked away." Elon read the message 3 times. There was no mention of media coverage. No list of requirements. No fee. Just an open request. A quiet room. A chance to speak with students who hadn't decided what to believe about the world yet. For reasons he didn't fully understand, he said yes. The auditorium wasn't large. Just a few hundred seats. No cameras. No press. No prepared remarks. Elon stood alone on the stage, wearing his usual black shirt and simple jacket. No podium. No slides. He looked out over the room of students and faculty. Some leaned forward with notepads. Others sat with arms crossed, waiting to see what he would do. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't begin with a joke. He simply said, "I'm not here to defend myself. I've done that too many times. And I'm not here to argue. I've lost interest in winning conversations." The room stayed quiet. Elon continued, "A week ago, I walked out of an interview. Not because I was angry, and not because I couldn't answer the questions. I left because I realized something was broken. Not just in that room. In how we talk to each other. In what we expect from each other." He paused. Every sentence I said was being prepared for the response, not the understanding. I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't listening to learn. She was listening to load the next question. I'm not angry at her for that. That's the game. But maybe it's not a game I want to play anymore. He let the silence stretch. I used to believe the best ideas would win. That if you made something better, more efficient, more sustainable, people would naturally see the value. But I was wrong. Ideas don't speak for themselves. People do. And if the people speaking them aren't trusted, the ideas don't matter. He looked down for a moment, then back up. I'm not a saint. I've made bad calls. I've said stupid things. I've tried to fix everything with code or logic because those are the tools I trust. But life isn't code. It's feeling. It's memory. It's misunderstanding. And sometimes, the only way to be heard is to stop talking. A student raised their hand. Elon nodded to them. The student asked, "Would you do the interview again?" Elon thought for a long moment, then said, "Yes, but I would walk out again, too." Another hand. This time, a young woman near the front. She asked, "What changed after that night?" Elon answered quietly, "I remembered what it felt like to be misunderstood for the right reasons. Not because I failed to explain, but because someone else wasn't ready to hear it. And I realized that's going to happen again. Probably often. But it doesn't mean I stop trying. It just means I choose where I speak. And to whom." There was a long silence after that. Not awkward, just full. When the talk ended, no one rushed the stage. A few students came to shake his hand. One slipped him a handwritten note. Most just nodded as they passed, as if thanking him for showing up not as a titan, but as a man still trying to make sense of his place in the noise. That night, back in his hotel room, Elon opened the handwritten note. It said, "We can't build the future if we're not allowed to be human in the present. Thank you for reminding me." He folded the note and placed it in his pocket. He didn't tweet about the event. He didn't mention it in any interview. But something inside him had shifted again. Not resolved, not repaired, just deeper and more certain. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the interview, but inside the tech world, the aftershocks hadn't stopped. Elon noticed the difference not in headlines, but in the kinds of meetings that followed. When he stepped into a conference room now, people didn't look at him quite the same way. There was less performance in their eyes, less expectation that he play the part, disruptor, billionaire, contrarian. They still asked for decisions. They still needed leadership. But something else had settled between them. A quieter kind of respect. Not for what he'd done, for what he hadn't. He had chosen not to fight the fire. And somehow, people had started looking for what he was trying to protect from it. At a systems review with his energy division, one engineer asked if they could name a new software build after the event. Half joking, half sincere. Elon smiled and said no, then paused and added, "But maybe name it after the silence that came after." That part mattered more. The team didn't laugh. They just nodded. People were listening differently now. That weekend, Grimes brought the kids over. It wasn't a press thing, just time. Elon sat on the floor with them while they built chaotic towers from magnetized tiles. His son knocked one over and laughed. Elon didn't correct him. He just helped build it back, slower this time, piece by piece. Later, after the kids had fallen asleep on the couch under a blanket, Grimes asked if he was okay. Not in the superficial way, in the real way. The kind of question that only comes from someone who's seen you collapse and rebuild too many times to count. Elon stared at the quiet screensaver drifting across the TV, then said, "I think something's finally catching up to me." Grimes asked, "What?" He answered, "That I can't outwork the feeling that I'm being misunderstood on purpose. And I think I'm tired of trying to fix it." She sat back, thought for a moment, then said something he hadn't expected. "You don't have to be understood by everyone. You just have to be understood somewhere." He looked at her, not for comfort, just for acknowledgement. She added, "Maybe the problem isn't that you said too much. Maybe it's that you kept trying to say it to the wrong rooms." That stayed with him. For days. The wrong rooms. He thought about the boardrooms, the summits, the forums where everyone already knew their angle before they walked in. Where questions weren't questions. They were traps disguised as curiosity. And then he thought about the quiet auditorium at the university, the technician in the office, the handwritten note in his pocket. Not loud rooms, but right ones. The next morning, he reopened the document. The one he had been rewriting in his head since the night of the walkout. This time, he didn't revise it. He just added one final line to the bottom. It said, "We can't build a better world if we keep demanding people perform their humanity on cue." Then, without announcement, he published it. Not on social media, not in a press release, but on an old blog page that hadn't been used in years. No headlines, no tags, just there, waiting. Within hours, it began to spread. Not virally, organically, quietly. People passed it to each other like a secret they wanted to protect. Some called it an essay. Others called it a journal entry. A few just called it the reminder. But the ones who read it carefully didn't argue over what it was. They just stopped and felt it. And that was enough. The words didn't trend. Not in the way algorithms usually carried stories. There was no surge. No overnight explosion. Instead, the essay moved like something older. Word of mouth. Private group chats. Screenshots without commentary. No one reposted it for attention. They shared it like it was a mirror. Elon watched quietly from a distance. He didn't check analytics. He didn't promote it. He let it exist without a push. Because for once, he wasn't trying to win anyone. He was just trying to be heard by someone who might finally listen. A week passed. Then another. Requests started to come in, not from networks or magazines, but from smaller, stranger places. A public library in Saskatchewan asked for permission to print the essay and leave it at the front desk. A high school teacher in Berlin wrote to say her students had asked to discuss it instead of the planned reading. A group of veterans in Arizona passed it around during a quiet Friday night gathering and sat in silence afterward, no one wanting to be the first to speak. Elon read those messages more than once. He didn't reply to all of them, but he saved every one. And then something happened that felt like closure, even if it never carried that name. Rachel Maddow sent a letter, not an email, not a tweet, a physical letter printed on simple stationery, with handwriting that was careful but unpolished. It arrived without fanfare. No camera crews. No statement. Just an envelope marked with a date and a city. In it, she wrote, "I rewatched the interview again. Not for content. Just for tone. For what I missed the first time. I watched the moment you looked at the producer, not me. I watched the way your hands moved when you said the word light. I watched the way you didn't flinch when I asked about harm, but you flinched when I asked about ego. I think I was asking the wrong questions. Or maybe I was asking them from the wrong place. I wanted to get it right. But maybe wanting to be right is what ruined it. I don't expect you to respond. I don't expect to be forgiven. But I wanted to say I saw it now. What you were trying to protect. What you were trying not to lose. And I think I understand why you left. Some silences deserve to be kept intact. I hope you're well." Elon read the letter once, then set it down. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt human, in the way that only comes when someone who misunderstood you finally chooses not to win, but to understand. Later that night, he walked out to the edge of the test site. The desert was quiet, the wind low. Above him, the sky was dark and clean, stars scattered like code across a screen no one could ever fully read. He stood still for a long time. And then, quietly, he whispered the words to no one. She saw it. Not because he needed it to be known, but because something inside him had been waiting. Not for praise. Not even for apology. Just to be seen. Really seen. And now he had been. There was no press release about the letter. No blog post. No comment. No acknowledgement. Elon never mentioned it to his team. He never quoted it. He never shared it. He folded the page and placed it in a drawer beside a small collection of objects he kept close but never displayed. A photo of his mother when she was young, a piece of heat shield from the first failed launch, and a crumpled napkin with a child's drawing of a rocket labeled "To Mars" from Daddy. The letter belonged there. Not because it proved anything. Because it didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, things returned to a strange kind of normal. The markets moved on. The news cycle shifted. New controversies emerged. Old ones were recycled. People stopped talking about the walk-off, at least publicly. But Elon noticed something quieter that lingered. When he entered a room now, people didn't just listen differently. They asked differently. Not what can we build, but what are we building it for? At a design review, one engineer, older, grizzled, not known for sentiment, paused in the middle of a presentation and said, "We should remember who this is for. It's not just a platform. It's power. And power should answer to people who don't sit in rooms like this." No one responded, but no one argued. Elon nodded, because that was the question that had followed him since the interview. Not whether he was right, but whether he was listening to the right voices. He began asking for more field reports, not executive summaries. Stories. From communities. From workers. From places where the technology touched real life instead of headlines. He read about towns where battery storage had kept hospitals open during blackouts. About families that could charge their car with sunlight. About kids who no longer did homework by candlelight. And every so often, he would stop and sit with one of those reports for longer than needed. Not because it changed his business, but because it reminded him why he had started it. Not for disruption, for dignity. One night, his son asked why people were still talking about the show. Elon smiled and asked, "What do they say?" His son shrugged. "Some say you were brave. Some say you were scared. Some say you lost." Elon nodded slowly, then said, "Do you know what I think?" His son looked up. "I think I didn't want to win." "Why not?" "Because sometimes winning means becoming what you're trying to fix." His son didn't speak for a moment, then asked the question Elon hadn't expected. Did she understand that? Elon paused, then said, "Eventually." His son asked, "Was that enough?" Elon smiled softly. "It was more than I expected." They sat together for a while, watching something slow and quiet drift across the screen. No explosions, no code, just two satellites orbiting Earth, locked in an elegant loop, neither overpowering the other, just moving in rhythm, guided by gravity and time. Elon pointed. "That's how conversations should be." His son didn't speak, but he kept watching. Spring came quietly. The world did not change overnight. There were still headlines designed to burn, still arguments disguised as questions, still rooms built for performance instead of understanding. But underneath all that, something had shifted, not in the media, not in the markets, but in the quiet space between people. Elon noticed it most in the pauses, in the seconds after someone spoke and before someone responded. There was more silence now, not empty, patient, a space where meaning had a chance to breathe. He had begun writing again, not for an audience, just for clarity, fragments, questions, memories, thoughts he couldn't always explain. He kept them in a private folder labeled "Only Wait." No one else read them. That was the point. He wasn't building a legacy anymore. He was building a relationship with truth, not the kind that convinced, the kind that endured. One morning, while walking through the lower floor of the Fremont factory, he passed a janitor who had worked there since the early days. A quiet man, always nodded, rarely spoke. This time, as Elon passed, the man paused and said, "I saw that show you walked off." Elon stopped. The man looked up and added, "You did the right thing. Not because you won, but because you didn't try to." Then he went back to mopping. Elon stood there for a moment. The floor smelled faintly of citrus cleaner. Machines hummed in the distance. Somewhere, metal sparked. Life continued. But that moment stayed with him. It was never about who watched him leave. It was always about who noticed why. He walked back to his office and opened a new document. He typed a single sentence. "You don't owe the world your performance." Then he closed the file and left the office for the rest of the day. No schedule, no calls, just air. He drove north, toward the hills. No destination, just motion. Eventually, he pulled off onto a small overlook. He stepped out of the car and stood on the edge of a wide view. Trees below, mountains beyond, clouds slow and soft above everything. He stayed there for a long time, not thinking, not deciding, just being. A wind passed through the trees. Somewhere, a bird called out once and then fell silent. And Elon breathed, without needing to explain it to anyone. Not because the world had changed, but because, for the first time in a very long time, he had.